Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving deep, you could say, into the world of Patrick Bowler.
Yes.
This is a name that's popped up, I think, a couple of times in your research.
It has.
Remember all those mentions of, like, a drug dealer with connections to the Science of Identity Foundation?
Yeah.
Well, this is the guy. And as you'll see, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye.
It is fascinating how you can start with just one name and end up in this really tangled web of connections. And in Bowler's case, we've got a really interesting mix. You've got aliases, international drug operations, this whole spiritual teaching side of things, and then, of course, the ties to the Science of Identity Foundation, this controversial religious group.
Exactly. You've given us this really interesting collection of stuff like articles and social media posts and even court documents. And from what I'm seeing, this guy went by Top Hat, the Guru, even like a misspelled Paramahamsa Das at some point.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on here?
Well, the aliases alone, right? That suggests this desire to really obscure his identity, which, if you think about it, it makes sense considering his involvement in criminal activities. I think the interesting thing here is how this desire to hide his identity coexists with his pretty public involvement in the Science of Identity Foundation.
Right. And this isn't just someone on the fringes of SIF either. Like, one document actually mentioned Bowler as a sponsor for a school that they ran in the Philippines.
Yeah, and that detail is really fascinating. I mean, the school operated kind of like a traditional Indian gurukula, where students live and learn under the guidance of a guru. Now, in this case, the guru, Chris Butler, who is the leader of SEF, he wasn't physically present, but it still creates this really specific environment, right? An environment where a figure like Bowler, with his connections and his resources, could potentially exert a lot of influence.
And that's even before we get into, like his actual conviction on drug trafficking charges in the U.S. The court documents paint a picture of him, like, as a real key player in a global operation, not just some, small-time dealer.
It certainly raises the question, right? Like, how could someone with this background, become so involved with a spiritual organization, with F? Did they know about his activities? Did they know the extent of what he was involved in? Or was he intentionally trying to use this connection, maybe as a cover?
It's kind of like we're looking at this puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Right.
And then you add in the fact that some sources describe Bowler as this incredibly generous guy, even teaching meditation in prison. It's kind of hard to reconcile that image with, like, a convicted drug trafficker.
That's what's so compelling about this deep dive. We're not dealing with a simple good guy, bad guy situation here. Bowler's story just seems to be full of these contradictions, and it begs the question, was he like a master manipulator who was just using spirituality as some sort of tool? Or was there a genuine desire for redemption woven into this complex life that he lived?
And, that complexity that you're talking about, it's reflected in SIF itself. I mean, on the surface, they promote things like yoga and meditation, which a lot of people find beneficial. But then there are all these allegations of controlling behavior and isolating people from the outside world.
It makes you wonder if those contrasting elements, the positive and the darker accusations, if they're somehow intertwined, both for Bowler as an individual and for the organization that he got so involved with.
This is definitely more than just like a simple biography.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a window into this whole other world where spirituality and crime and even politics all intersect.
Yeah.
Speaking of politics, you mentioned the Gabbard family earlier. They factor into the story too, right?
Yeah, the Gabbard family, they're a big part of the story, especially Mike Gabbard. He was a pretty prominent politician in Hawaii. And his wife, Carol, they were both early followers of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
And I remember seeing somewhere that their daughter, Tulsi Gabbard, the former congresswoman, she's talked about her connection to Butler and the SEF too.
Right. And what's interesting is that the sources suggest that Bowler's relationship with the Gabbards, it went beyond just shared religious beliefs. One article actually mentions this alleged plan to discredit a political opponent of Mike Gabbard, and it was apparently orchestrated by this guy, Rick Reed, who was another SIF devotee and political ally of Gabbard. And guess who's mentioned as being involved in all of that? Patrick Bowler.
Oh, wow. So now we're talking about potential political maneuvering, maybe even some dirty tricks, all connected back to Bowler. This is getting pretty wild.
It definitely shows how Bowler's influence might have gone way beyond just drug trafficking and into the political sphere. And remember, this was back in the 80s when the Gabbards and their whole SIF-connected network, they were really gaining political power in Hawaii.
It makes you wonder if Bowler was using his SIF connections to, push his own agenda, whatever that might have been at the time.
That's the big question, isn't it? Was he just exploiting these relationships for his own benefit? Or was there some sort of genuine, I don't know, alignment of interests there? The sources don't really give a clear answer, but it definitely raises the possibility that Butler was more than just a passive participant in all of this.
Okay, so let me get this straight. We have a convicted drug trafficker with ties to this controversial religious group, maybe even meddling in political stuff. Is there anything else we need to know about?
Well, there is one more layer to this whole thing that we should probably talk about. Bowler's involvement with a company called QNet.
Oh yeah, QNet. I
Yeah.
think I came across that name in my research too. It's some sort of multi-level marketing company, right?
Yeah. Yeah, QNet's a pretty controversial company. They've had all these accusations of basically operating as a pyramid scheme in a bunch of different countries. Their business model relies way more on recruitment than on actually selling products, and that can lead to a lot of exploitation, where people at the bottom, they struggle to make any money at all. And guess who was really close with the founder? Vijay Eswaran, Patrick Bowler.
No way, seriously.
Yeah.
So now, on top of everything else, we can add potential financial fraud to the list of things Bowler was involved in. This guy really got around.
He definitely did. And it gets even more complicated when you realize that both Bowler and Eswaran were charged together with racketeering in the Philippines. And this case involved, like, millions of dollars. It's just another example of how his story is tied up with these really complex networks and controversial figures.
It's kind of hard to believe how many things connect back to this one guy. We started with a drug dealer, and now we've got spiritual teachings, political stuff, alleged financial schemes. It's like he had his fingers in everything. Do we know why he would get involved with QNet in the first place? Was it just like a continuation of his other activities, or was there something else going on there?
It's a great question, and honestly, the sources don't really give us a clear answer, but there is one little detail that might give us some clues about this whole QNet connection.
Okay, so what is it? What's the detail about QNet?
Well, one source mentioned this high-ranking QNet guy named Joseph Bismark, and it turns out he's also been a longtime follower of Chris Butler, the SIF leader.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and apparently Bismarck owns a couple of homes in Kailua on Oahu, and they were actually used by Butler and his disciples.
So there's a direct link between someone really important at QNet and the leader of SIF.
Exactly.
Could this mean that there was something more to Bowler's involvement with QNet than just money? Like, was there some kind of connection to his SIF stuff?
It's definitely possible. This connection to Bismarck really makes you wonder if Bowler's ties to SIF played a role in his whole association with QNet. Was it like a coordinated thing or just a coincidence? It's hard to say for sure. The sources we have don't really give us a definite answer.
It's really unbelievable how everything seems to circle back to this guy, Patrick Bowler. We started with just this mention of a drug dealer,
Yeah.
and now we've got this whole complicated web that spans, like, continents. It touches on everything, spirituality and crime and political influence, international business. It's crazy.
It really shows how important critical thinking is, and examining sources carefully, especially when you're dealing with controversial figures and organizations like SIF. It's easy to get caught up in all the sensational stuff, but you have to step back and look at it from different angles.
You're totally right. It's so easy to just believe whatever you read, especially when it comes to someone as mysterious as Patrick Bowler.
Right.
But as we've seen, there's often a lot more to the story than you might think at first.
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting, We've gone way beyond just listing facts. We've really dug into the complexity and contradictions surrounding Bowlers.
So what does this all mean for our listeners out there as they continue their own research? I think the biggest takeaway here is to approach everything with a critical eye. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions and think about different interpretations of the information you're seeing.
And remember, the sources we looked at today, they just give us a small glimpse into Patrick Bowler's world. Who knows what other connections and influences are still out there? Maybe that's something you can look into yourself.
That's a great point to end on. As you continue to explore and learn more about this case, keep in mind that the story of Patrick Bowler is far from over. There might be even more to uncover about his motivations, his network, and the impact he had on everyone around him.
Absolutely. And who knows what other fascinating deep dives are waiting for us in the future.